I work on a small dairy farm in the upper Midwest. It kinda has a weird layout, but I'll try my best. Right when you walk in, there's the milk house, then you keep going, and you're in the parlor. Once you go to the edge of the parlor, you can turn left into the calf barn, or right and make your way out to the big barn where the milking cows are. Also, I should mention that the calf barn is connected to an older barn that we keep pregnant cows in. The doors are never locked because we have people coming in at random times throughout the day. Plus, it's a barn, and there are doors literally everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Anyways, I'm a female who is fairly thin, maybe 5'5", 120-ish pounds, and mind you, I'm still in high school. One night I was working the night shift, so anywhere between 8:30 to 2 a.m., because you never know how long farm work might take sometimes. Every shift we work with one other person, and this night happened to be with another high schooler about my age, but she's a bit taller than me. But every shift we milk the first bin, then I'll go into the calf barn and turn the lights on and start pasteurizing so I can feed the calves. So I went and did that, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and I went back to help milk the second bin. After the second pen, I went to feed the calves. So here's a layout of the calf barn. There's an alley down with the weaned calves in the left and hay and grain on the right for feeding. Then at the end of it is a big room. There's a row of 7 hutches right as you walk in, from left to right, and then 2 in the left corner. Then there's 6 pens, 3 on each side, with a little milk house in the middle for the feeding purposes. The doors on the milk house are always closed to keep in warm air. So I go in there and start my normal feeding routine, still not noticing anything strange. Then I open the door on the other side of the milk house to feed the far pens, and that's when I noticed the older, almost weaned calves in the right pen were very skittish. I just ignored it at first, went about what I was doing, and then I saw him, a man huddled in the corner of the pen, just sitting there and all black and bundled up because it was cold as hell out there that night. But as he sat there just looking at me, smiling, in between those far 2 pens is a double door that again isn't locked, making it easier for someone to get in. Anyways, I was holding a 5-liter bucket filled with milk and dropped it, spilling it all over the ground. I've never booked it so fast out of there. I told my coworker what had happened, and we hid out in the break room for a little bit with our barn dog. We eventually got the courage to go back and check it out, but the man was gone. He never threatened us or the cows, and nothing went missing. I don't know if he was a homeless man looking for shelter in the cold or what, but my barn is a tad far out of town for that. What scares me the most is that I walked in there more than once a day and still didn't even notice him, so I have no idea how long he had been watching me. I've worked 2 night shifts since then and worked 1 other night. Since then I have been sure to scan the barn and lock the doors while I am feeding. So a note to everyone, not just farmers, always lock your doors. And to that creepy man in one of my calf pens, let's not meet again. My husband and I were at the supermarket, and our baby was being especially fussy, so he took her for a quick drive, the motion of which usually calms her down. It only took about 10 minutes to settle her, and I was in the store, but was unsure how much longer I'd be, and there's poor reception inside. So he pulled back into the parking lot to wait for me. It was an unseasonably nice day, so he took her in her car seat to sit on one of the benches outside the store. He took a business call and just sat them down, absent-mindedly rocking the carrier when a woman, well-dressed, mid-30s, average height, fit build, approached them. It's not uncommon for people to ask to play with our baby. She's got big rosy cheeks, soft wisps of golden hair, and the most adorable, toothless grin, especially when she's deep into a good nap. But her nap schedule is paramount, so my husband was preparing to tell the woman she actually couldn't play with our baby right then. She walked over right in their direction, brimming with nonchalant confidence, and before he could even finish his sentence explaining she was napping and not to be touched, she picked up the carrier and started walking off. He was in shock for a moment, not fully believing someone would be so ballsy enough to do something so sinister in plain daylight. So he said, "Excuse me, put her down." As his panic mounted, she remained calm this entire time, but when he called after her, she started walking away more briskly. He ran full speed ahead and tried to grapple the carrier out of her hands, finally resulting to restraining her arms. The woman yells, "Help! He's trying to take my baby! Kidnapping! 911! Help!" kicking him in the shin and pulling a pink bottle of pepper spray out of her handbag. Of course, no one in the parking lot was clocking the earlier interaction and assumed he was really a kidnapper, a lone man in a Deadpool t-shirt versus a tiny well-dressed woman. Immediately, a man drop-kicked my husband to the ground and was holding him down. He could hear bystanders encouraging the woman to file a police report, but she was doing a very convincing job of acting shaken up and insisted she just wanted to go home. To make matters worse for my husband, she was driving a minivan. He was in a raw state of panic, realizing the entire parking lot had banded together to inadvertently facilitate the kidnapping of our daughter. He was begging and pleading with them. No one was listening. They just kept screaming at him that the jig was up and he needed to lie still and wait for the police and stop terrorizing a young mother. My husband finally had the novel idea to show them family pictures on his phone, but too panicked to think clearly. This manifested as he shouted, "I have pictures of the baby on my phone," which of course everyone interpreted as having either stalking pictures or worse, pornographic images of the baby. It was at this point that a man, I can't entirely blame the man considering what he thought was going on, kicked my husband as hard as he could in the ribs. It was at this point I was coming out of the store and thought he was being robbed by these people. I was yelling for security, so panicked my chest constricted and I could barely get any sound out. It was only then I realized he did not have our baby with him. When I saw she was being held by a woman, I was relieved. I thought maybe the woman had intervened to move my daughter out of harm's way while my husband was being robbed and was walking away to get help. I couldn't find a security guard outside the store, so I ran up to the people holding my husband down, waving my wallet, pleading, "Take everything you want, just let him up and leave us alone." And one of the men holding my husband down said something like, "Lady, we need to wait for the police to deal with him." And I was so confused. Why would the muggers have called the police? I just kept stammering, "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" And made out someone yelling, "He tried to abduct the woman's kid." I did not understand, and I was sure I misheard him. My husband never hurt a child, and we have 4 kids. If he were going to commit a crime, bringing home another kid would be at the bottom of his list. I kept trying to understand what the man was saying, and suddenly it all clicked. I looked around for the woman who had the baby carrier, and she was halfway across the parking lot. I went into total ballistic trigger cub mode, literally leaped out of my heels, and sprinted across the parking lot. I'm not a UFC fighter. I've never taken any self-defense classes, so all I could think of was to grab the woman by her hair and squeeze her throat with my other hand, which didn't do much. She was getting away even as I grappled her. Amazingly, none of the other bystanders had yet to connect that my husband was telling the truth, and this woman was abducting our baby. I yanked her hair as hard as I could, and that was enough for her to drop the carrier. I was so scared and surprised that I actually threw myself on top of the carrier, covering the entire thing in a blanket, and stayed that way without saying or doing anything. The woman left. Not one person tried to stop her, even though she was clearly leaving without the child she claimed was hers, which would be pretty damn incriminating if I had watched this scene unfold. Within the next couple of minutes, police had arrived. After all that, there were still several bystanders who explained it was all my husband trying to kidnap the baby. The police, in my horror, assumed that she must have had bad intentions. The first question they asked me after getting her description weren't investigative. They were questions thinly veiled, trying to convince me not to pursue charges, still placing blame on my husband. A small sample. Does your husband and the baby look dissimilar? Could your husband have been doing something inappropriate or violent to the baby that would make her feel compelled to grab the baby from the situation? Did she seem groggy or confused? Could she have mistaken either of them for her own family members? They spent more time verifying the baby was actually mine than they concerned themselves with the fact that the baby was actually not hers. My husband had called his brother at this point, who works in an office with a lot of lawyers, and connected with one ASAP, who gave us the priceless advice to get every officer's name and badge number to request copies of the store's security tapes right away, and to escalate our complaint higher up the chain if these officers weren't taking us seriously. Finally, we had reason enough to believe we were being taken seriously, and we went home and both just shook and cried until we had to get our other kids from school. My husband seething with rage and grappling a feeling of helplessness from how little he was able to do, and has 2 cracked ribs from when the man kicked him. To the officer's credit, they did ask if he'd like to press charges, but considering the man was genuinely convinced at the time that he was on the right side of intervening in a kidnapping and stayed to talk to the police and apologized profusely when the truth became clear, he denied to press charges. Amazingly and frustratingly, there were still people who stuck around to talk to the police, who were giving my husband dirty looks, and one man who even implored the police to involve CPS to verify it was really our baby. This happened on December 21st, 2016. I am a 21-year-old Canadian girl, 19 at the time. At this time in my life, I was pretty desperate for attention, and so I went on a lot of bad dates and put myself in a lot of bad situations. When this pretty cute guy started hitting on me, I was pretty flattered and agreed to do some mushrooms at his place and to get to know each other better. I'm not going to go into details, but let's just say that it was a really bad idea, so I ended up leaving his place around midnight, high as fuck, with a long and cold walk to the train station. It really didn't bother me though. To be honest, I was just happy to be out of that situation. And on my way home, I also really enjoyed the cold, and had done mushrooms many times by this point, and was really enjoying the walk. It was just a straight walk in mostly residential streets until you came into a busier street that leads to downtown. It separates the residential streets from the mall that I worked at the time, and Wendy's, and a Wendy's that was closer to the lights, where I had to cross. Just beyond the mall is the train station. You have to walk either through the mall parking lot or through a field where the old high school used to be to get to the train station. So I got to the lights and was waiting to cross. However, it was quite late and the lights were taking what felt like forever to change. That's when a big blue pickup truck came driving down the road away from downtown. It slowed right down as it passed by me before speeding off. I probably should have sensed some danger, but my high ass was worried that he slowed down to let me pass, and when I didn't, he left, making me think that the light wasn't going to change. I then noticed that the same blue truck had pulled around the block and was sitting in the parking lot at the closed Wendy's. Now I realized that something was wrong. The light finally changed and I walked across the street. I planned on just walking past it and going through the mall parking lot to get to the train. I kept my head down as I walked. The man in the truck yelled something at me as I walked past. I looked up, and in my state I thought it was a regular customer of mine as I worked at the mall. I raised my arms in the air like, "Fuck, you got me." But as I approached the truck, I realized how wrong I was. This was a completely different person, and I was now at the side of his truck in an abandoned Wendy's parking lot. I just stared at him. I could feel someone staring at me from the back seat of the truck, right behind the driver's seat, but there was no one in the front passenger seat. The driver smiled and asked me things straight out of the PSA, things like, "What part of the city do you live in? And do you live alone?" I was being polite and actually answered his questions truthfully, because for some reason I thought he was a cop. I mean, that has to be why he is questioning me. He obviously knew I was high, and was trying to make sure I got home safe, right? Wrong. In a matter of maybe 5 minutes, he knew what part of the city I lived in, that I lived with my dad, and that I planned on taking the train home. It wasn't until that he straight up asked for directions to my house that I played dumb and said I didn't know. He kinda raised his eyebrows at me and said,
"So you don't know where you live?"
I kinda laughed and was like, "Nope, I guess not." And I walked around to the back of his truck, headed for the field to get to the train station, and he pulled away. I had to cross a small street to get to the field. I noticed further down the street with the truck parked facing me, and looked at it. It inched forward a little bit to make it seem like he was leaving. I turned around and kept walking. I turned around a few seconds later to see the truck is still there. I put my arms in the air and yelled, "I fucking see you!" He then drove off as he was going to circle the mall. I ran into the field and pulled out my phone and dialed 911 and paused before pressing call. I was clearly high on drugs, and there was a good chance that I wouldn't be taken seriously. I was also worried that I was going to have to take the cops back to the guy's house, as it had been where I got the drugs from, so instead I called my dad. By the time he picked up the phone, I was crying. I explained to him what was happening, and he said to get somewhere safe and call a cab. If I had been smart, I would have taken the train a couple of steps in the wrong direction, and then called a cab. I didn't. Instead, I went to the train station that he knew I was going to be at and called the cab. I waited for 20 minutes. I kept peeking out to see if he was there, but I didn't see him. My cab arrived, and I got in and told the cab where to go. I was looking behind us the whole time. Just before we made it to downtown, I noticed that a large truck was behind us, but I couldn't see the color until we turned, and the truck turned behind us. It was, of course, blue. I started freaking out, and I begged for the cab to pull over. He did so reluctantly, and the blue truck slowly rolled by and then turned the corner, like he was going to drive back around the block. I yelled at the driver to start going again, and he did so, very annoyed. I finally did make it back home and collapsed on the bed in tears. I didn't leave my house for 2 days, terrified that he was driving around my neighborhood looking for me. I did see him and his truck one more time, but it's not really worth mentioning. Please be safe, people. There are so many things that I could have done to prevent this from happening, but I was too high and dumb to think straight. Before any judgment is placed, I would like to say I wasn't in the best state of mind during this situation. I just went through a particularly difficult breakup, a suicide attempt, moved back in with my parents, then experienced a sexual assault by a trusted friend. I didn't have a good judge of character, and was by far hitting my rock bottom. After several months at my mother's house, and after the sexual assault, I realized I desperately needed to get out of that atmosphere and tried to get back up on my feet. I found a cheap home for rent and began my life all over again. It wasn't the nicest place, and certainly not as warm and comforting as my last place, but it would do temporarily. Shortly after moving in, still not in the right mindset, and with a huge lack of self-care, I began using almost anything I could get my hands on. Many psychedelics and MDMA. Anyone who has experienced MDMA can tell you it gives you this incredible sense of happiness and content, which at the time I had neither. These short-term bouts of false happiness sucked any remaining serotonin from my brain and left me feeling empty inside. On top of that, after my suicide attempt, I was abruptly taken off of all of my medications, as I used them to hurt myself prior. This meant my sleeping medication and with it trickled down that familiar insomnia. Then my SSRI, which when stopping abruptly can exceedingly send you into a state of manic depression and confusion. It took me out of my agoraphobia and helped me with my PTSD triggers, which having my attacker live just several blocks away on the very same street as another individual whom abused me from 11 until 14, I simply lost all abilities to cope. After some time of intense withdrawals from my anxiety medication and even experiencing a seizure, I began to buy pills. The only ones available to me were Xanax, which I quickly developed a tolerance for, and at my worst was taking anywhere between 12 and 20 milligrams a day. Because of the Xanax abuse, there are many things I didn't completely recall, such as my wedding to a bass-playing musician I had only known for a month, as well as much of the month we spent together. My most vivid memories were lying on the couch watching The Office on Netflix, religiously shaking and sweating in between buys and re-ups from my pill dealer. I began drinking and hanging out with the wrong crowd. The ones that couch surfed much of their lives, destroyed things in their path, didn't work, and commonly used others, burning each individual's bridge as they passed. As I was in no state to actually care, I enjoyed their company, and one individual in particular, I'll refer to as Sideshow Bob, started to become what I thought was my best friend, even wearing a dress at my wedding as my maid of honor. He often wore women's clothes, not because he was a transgender, but because he simply liked to. Some made fun of him for this, but I thought it was cool that he didn't care what others thought. He seemed to have a kind and goofy nature about him that I admired, but as a man that wore women's clothes, he'd often get into my closet. I'd like to add that Bob had very poor hygiene. He wore no deodorant, he showered rarely, and those feet left a smell that permanently absorbed into the carpet fibers that stayed even when I moved out. He would often hop on the couch around 4 p.m. or so and rush to his pizza delivery job. He never stopped to shower or even brush his teeth. He'd even wake up and throw back on the same uniform he had been wearing for weeks, which stunk of cheap weed, pizza grease, and feet. On New Year's Eve 2016, I left my husband at the time. After a serious withdrawal and being around a completely sober, it became obvious he was using meth. I was suspicious of it before, as I used to use it when I was much younger, along with nearly half of all of my family members. I can always sense it. He knew before marrying me that this was going to be a big no for me. My brother in prison, my father's heart attack and death, all combined to meth use. He knew this when he married me, yet kept it a secret. I do blame myself partly for this. It's the kind of things that occurs when you marry a stranger. About a year later, he passed away from a shot laced with fentanyl. They found his body 5 days later. After the separation of my husband, I allowed Bob to stay. He didn't have a room. He slept on the couch. He didn't contribute to the groceries or bills, and quite frankly, turned my home into a disgusting mess. But since my OCD seemed to have dissolved into my drinking, and I preferred not being alone with my thoughts, I didn't really mind. Within a week of leaving my husband, Bob grew increasingly more obsessed with the thought of us being together. I made it very clear I had no intentions with him and valued our friendship, not to mention I was about to experience my first divorce and all the shame that came along with it. I started avoiding him. Every time I'd return to the home, he'd be there, in tears. Some days I'd find him not only in my clothes, but in my bed. Eventually, he quit his job. To have a better chance of seeing me. He'd follow me room to room, demanding to know why it is that he can't see us together. Eventually I told him if he didn't stop, he'd need to leave. But he was quick to throw back in my face that legally he was a tenant in my home, and he needed 30 days' notice. "I'm not going anywhere, you bitch," is what he said. Things got more aggressive. I grew more uncomfortable and afraid by the days. His tears turned to anger. His questions turned to screaming. One very vivid memory I have of him staring me directly in the eyes, red-faced, spit flying, screaming, "I'm sick of fucking being rejected by women." He was no longer my goofy drinking buddy. He was someone I absolutely could not be around. A police officer suggested I get a restraining order to get him off the premise, which I did. Then I kept the doors locked. His only few possessions in my house were a guitar and an amp, which I placed on the back porch, then notified him. He immediately tried to break into the house, kicking the old front door with some force. I could see it begin to crack at the deadbolt, leaving dark shoe prints on the cracked paint. The police had trouble serving him. He quit his job. He had no actual address, although I provided them with his car description, license plate, and friends' addresses. Morning, noon, and night, I'd find myself crying, pressed up against that door hoping it wouldn't break open. Every time I called the police, he had already left. I found myself up that night, staring out the window, watching that loud green car of his drive by, feeling my pulse rise, phone in hand. For weeks I received surprise visits from him. Most were terrifying. Occasionally some were thought out. One evening, he had a mutual friend knock on the door, which I happily opened, only for him to quickly jump out from behind the door and attempt entering. I moved as swiftly and as strongly as I could, slammed the door, and locked it. Kicking again, calling 911 again, he'd leave again. After a few months, he moved on. He found a girlfriend who kicked him out quite quickly. He responded by beating her unconscious and attempting to cut her throat. Luckily, a neighbor heard the commotion, and Bob quickly ran. He got off easy on those charges, but of course if you Google his name you see the repeated charges of serious assault. I spoke with his exes. I saw the photos of what he had done to their faces, their bodies. All I can think about is how that could have been me. The last time I saw him was back in my hometown at the local grocery store, as I waited for a cup of coffee. After a tiring 10-hour shift at my last job, he nodded with a kind of smile. I froze, heart throbbing, hand shaking. It was that day I moved, an hour and a half away. It is this month I'll be moving back. I let a friend stay with me and crash on the couch until he became obsessed with the thought of us being together. He began sleeping in my bed when I wasn't home, wore my clothes. If I came home, he'd cry and follow me. Then that eventually turned into him screaming and cornering me. I got a restraining order against him, but the police could never find him to serve him. Despite showing it to him, he still repeatedly tried to break into my home for over a month. Sometime later, he got a girlfriend and beat her unconscious and attempted to cut her throat. I moved an hour and a half away from that town, but will still be returning at the end of this month. Our university is in a kind of a shitty city, but it's small. The main problem is the layout. One street you're in a perfectly safe, middle-class family territory, but one wrong turn and you're in gang turf. There's not a lot of room to get lost safely. My roommate and I don't live in the worst area, but I will say there's a reason our rent is cheap, and why our landlords installed super bright motion detectors lights all around the house. We have been super strict about keeping everything locked up, keeping valuables out of sight of windows, trying to keep the fact that we are a couple of early 20s females living alone on the down low, and besides, one small incident in the first month. We were there, nothing had happened, and we generally felt pretty secure last semester. Class doesn't start until the 30th, but I headed back this past Saturday. Roommate has also been back for a couple of weeks because of her internship. This happened the night I got back, around 11 p.m. I was just hanging out in the living room watching movies. I had bought some wine and just turned 21 before New Year's, so this was very exciting for me, and I was feeling like a real adult. My roommate was sleeping over at her boyfriend's house. I started hearing this tapping noise on the window by our front door. For a little while, I just ignored it, pretty sure it was just my imagination. The blinds were down, I couldn't see anything, but I was still sure that the motion lights would come on if someone was out there, and they weren't, so I was sure it was fine. As time passes, however, I realize that no, that's definitely not tapping, and it's moving from one window to the next, progressively getting closer to where I'm sitting. I muted the TV to listen better, and as soon as I did, the tapping paused, and then came back louder and much faster. At this point, I'm frozen, totally freaked out, but when the tapping moved to the window right next to my head, I grabbed my phone and slid off the couch, crawled into the kitchen, where we have glass sliding doors, and peered out. It was hard to make out, but thankfully the kitchen lights were off, which made it a little easier to see outside. And the lights coming through the living room windows, combined with some light from the street lamps, just barely allowed me to see a man crouched in the garden, face pressed against the glass, and I mean smushed right up against it. He had one hand stretched way up and was tapping with a couple of fingers. I was just like, fuck. I think he was trying different windows because he couldn't see inside well and didn't know where I was sitting, except that the living room was the only room in the house with lights on. Or at least that's what I was hoping when I crawled out of the living room, down the hall, and into my bedroom. I locked the door, but kept the lights off, and called the police. They asked if he was actively trying to break into the house, and I said no, and they said they would send someone over as quickly as possible. I was really hoping the officer would stay on the line, but they just gave me instructions to call again if things escalated and hold tight. 15 minutes later, still no police. I wasn't sure if he was out there, but I was trying to find out on my own. I'd been trying to call my roommate, but she wasn't answering her phone, and I didn't know who else to call. Eventually, I decided to call my ex-boyfriend, because he had been my go-to person for the last 2 years, and I couldn't think of anyone else. He's a good dude, and still came over, since he lives only a few minutes away. Around 10 minutes after I called him, I could tell he was there, because I could hear shouting and then running. Another 5 minutes or so, and he calls, and he says he's out front and to let him in. He told me there was a dude with a small bag at the kitchen door, peering in and trying to force the door open. He yelled and the guy dropped the bag and started running. My ex chased him a little bit until they got to this one shitty road towards the back of my neighborhood, and then he headed back. Motion lights didn't come on this whole time. A few minutes later, the cops came. It was only over a half an hour since I called them, but it felt like so much longer. Cops searched the area, didn't find anyone. The only thing that they found was a bag. The only thing that was in the bag was lube and a box of condoms, which makes me want to die if I think about it too hard. I didn't have a solid description of him, having not seen him well, and neither did my ex. The cops said that they would keep someone outside, and my ex spent the night in the living room to keep an eye on me. My roommate finally came back at like 7 a.m. going, "What the hell happened?" Her boyfriend also spent the night every night since. Honestly, I don't know if I was just shocked or processing, but the next couple of days, I was kinda, about the whole thing. Even though I knew the guy was still out there, my roommate called our landlords and bitched at them about the lights not working. I went to my job and told my coworker about it. But then yesterday my roommate called me as soon as she got out of her internship, freaking out, and told me she had something to tell me. So her internship with the social work program has her working with and occasionally leading a group of court-ordered drug addicts, which includes some sex offenders. She told me that while she was leading the group, she was just not getting along with one of the members, who was being very contrary and just acting annoyed with what she was saying. And towards the end, he said something along the lines of, Your roommate's cute. You can tell her I like Asian girls, and that we need to fix our front porch light. I'm pretty sure that he didn't have an opportunity to see my face that night, so I don't know how many times he has been there. She reported him. Her supervisor just got in contact with the police and he confessed easily. I guess he probably followed my roommate home one night, which is terrifying to me, and I'm glad he never tried to do anything to her. And he also must have known that she would report him after he said those things to her. So I don't understand his thinking at all. It's just today that I'm starting to feel really freaked out about the whole thing, and I will probably not be spending the night alone here for a while.
Alright, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead, like, share, subscribe. Thank you for watching.